Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Ask the Experts virtual series. Today, we'll be discussing how critical it is for your association to have a thorough and accurate reserve study. My name is Allison Thiel. I'm a regional director here at First Service Residential, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Before I introduce our panel and dive into our discussion, we have a few housekeeping items. I'll run through these quickly. If you have a question throughout the webinar, please submit it through the Q&A option on your control panel. We have a series of poll questions throughout the webinar for you to provide your input. Once the results of the poll have been shared, you'll need to click the X in the upper left-hand corner in order to close the box. There's no need to take notes. We'll be recording the entire session and sending it to all the attendees. Should you have any additional questions following our webinar, feel free to contact our panelists directly, and we'll be sharing their contact information in the chat in just a few minutes. We've got a great program for you today, so let's dive in, beginning with the introductions of our panel. Joining us today is Drew Isaac. Drew is the president of Drew Isaac and Associates. Drew?
Good morning, everyone. Glad you're joining us.
Thank you, Drew. John Lee is the Vice President of First Service Financial. John?
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And then we have An Nguyen. He's a Vice President with First Service Residential in North Florida. Good morning, An.
Good morning, Allison. Thank you for having me join you today.
My pleasure to have all gentlemen here. Thank you. Our focus today is centered around how your association's reserve study is critical to your community's financial health. We're all in budget season right now, so I know this is a focus for everyone. After all, a thorough and accurate reserve study will help you generate your maintenance schedule, prepare for capital improvements, and plan strategically for the future. Today, our panel will discuss the following topics: what your reserve study should entail, what to consider when hiring a reserve study specialist, and how often and when to update your reserve study, and much more. We've asked board members to submit some questions for discussion, but before we get to those, I want to ask our panelist, An, to lay the groundwork of a reserve study. So An, can you kick us off by answering the two classic questions that are the cornerstone of all reserve discussions? And those are, what are reserves and what can associations use reserves for?
Thanks, Allison. It's great to join you all today. I think before we answer the question of what reserves are, we need to start by talking about an important terminology that every board member needs to memorize, and that is fiduciary duty or fiduciary responsibility. When you become a board member, you no longer can think as an owner or as a resident, but you have to think about what's best for the community, because you now have a fiduciary duty to do what is best for the community. And one of your fiduciary duties is to protect your property values. And one way you do that is simply by setting aside reserve funds. So your reserves are funds that essentially help the association plan ahead for major repairs and replacements that will happen in the future. While your operating funds, are for the day-to-day operating expenses like the electric bill, insurance, personnel, contracts, repairs, and maintenance, your reserve funds are for major repairs and replacements that will be performed less frequently than yearly and will result in maintaining or extending the useful life of an asset. Now, in the state of Florida, for condos, reserve funds should be set aside for deferred maintenance and capital expenditures that will cost more than $10,000. So, for example, resurfacing your pool, replacing the roofs on your buildings, painting your buildings, repaving your streets and parking lots. These are reserve items that don't happen every year, and because they are large expenses, you have to set aside funds to plan to pay for those expenses when they're due. And remember, these reserve funds that you save up can only be used for reserve expenses unless a membership vote is taken. Now, the flip side of this, if you do not set aside a prudent reserve fund, you're going to have to special assess your owners in order to pay for those reserve expenses. And we all know that special assessments are not appreciated by owners. So if you plan to fulfill your fiduciary responsibility as a board member, set aside a prudent reserve.
Thank you, An, for that explanation. That's the perfect groundwork for today's discussion. And the ideal segue for our next question, which I will call on our subject matter expert, Drew. Drew, tell us what exactly is a reserve study?
Well, thank you, Allison. In the simplest terms, it is a budget planning tool, a long-range capital budget planning tool. Now, the ingredients of a reserve study are basically two parts, a physical analysis and a financial analysis. So in the physical analysis, we look at things like roofs, painting, paving, major equipment replacement, and we identify either by statutory requirement or using what we call a four-part test to determine what components should be included in the reserves. And once we've identified those components, we will then determine their quantity, cost, life expectancy, and the physical analysis is probably the largest portion of the time we spend in preparing a reserve study. It is based on a site inspection and a condition assessment of those components. Now, once we have the reserve components, that physical analysis done, we then move into what we call the financial analysis, where we take this information and we combine it with the reserve budget and the balance information in order to calculate a funding plan. Now, this is what we would consider to be a stable and equitable funding plan, where we are going to tell you how much your reserve should be as far as contribution goes, as well as what your projected expenditures are, the amounts in the years that they're planned for. Also, in the financial analysis, we do what's called a fund status. And this is where we determine your relative funding strength currently, as opposed to, say, 100% fully funded. And so this gives you a guide or a litmus test as to where you are in terms of your funding in your reserve plan. Now, I will say this about reserve plans. They do come in different varieties. If you're new to this, there are, according to CAI's National Reserve Study Standards, there are actually 4 different levels. The first one, if you're just getting started, is what we call a level 1 or a first-time reserve study. And this includes a site inspection and basically starting from scratch. Once you've got that completed, then you're eligible to do what is either called the level 2 or a level 3 reserve study. And basically one is called a reinspection, level 2, and one is called an update without site visit. And basically what that does is that after you establish a baseline reserve study, you can update those studies in the future, sometimes with a reinspection and sometimes without, depending on how many years has passed since the initial study was complete. So both of these studies are based off of the initial study. And what happens with an update is obviously the costs are adjusted, the financial information is adjusted, as well as a new plan is projected. So this helps keep the association on target. It's not one of these types of reports where you do it and forget about it. It's sort of a living, breathing document that has to be completely updated and changed as costs go on and things change in the future. The last one doesn't really apply to this group, but it's a level 4 study, and that's basically for developers. We do pre-construction, based off of construction plans and documents. But those are the 4 levels of reserve studies and the basics of what is included in a study.
Terrific. Thank you, Drew. That was a very thorough explanation of what a reserve study actually is. And I actually learned a little bit about reserve studies from your discussion. But that leads me to our next question. Why does an association even need a reserve study? And for that, I'm going to look to John Lee. John?
Yeah, great question, Allison. I think, at the start of this, you hit on budget season. And as we know in Florida, every budget that our association sent out has to have a reserve element attached to it, right? Whether or not reserves are funded is another story, but every year our associations are sending out budgets with a proposal for funding reserves, and it paints a clear financial picture of what reserve funding looks like. So if your association funds reserves, great. Your schedule comes in the reserve study that Drew prepares, and there are your numbers, right? If your association doesn't fund reserves, I think a reserve study is just as crucial. Share the data with your membership, right? It paints that clear financial picture of what big ticket items will cost to replace and when the bill for them is coming due. So An touched on it earlier. If we're waiving reserves, if we're not funding reserves, if our reserves are not where they should be, that doesn't change the cost of the elements that we're going to have to replace at a given point in time. It's a great opportunity for every board to stand in front of their membership and say, these are going to be our expenses in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And Drew touched on it, right? His report will lay that out sequentially for you. So, then you get into the discussion of what will we do if we don't fund reserves, which I think we'll get to in a minute. But yeah, we need a reserve study whether we fund reserves or not. And An, I think you have some insight on statute and funding of reserves, right?
Yeah, and John mentioned it already. In Florida, statute does talk about when you're doing your budget, setting aside mandatory reserves. For condos, there are 3 statutorily required reserve items: roof replacement, painting, and pavement resurfacing. So at the very least, if you're a condo in the state of Florida under 718, you have to have at the very least those 3 reserve items. Florida statute does not require associations to do a reserve study. It's just not in there, either in 718 for condos or 720 for HOAs. But it does require, like John said, that the budget set aside a reserve schedule for repair and replacement of major components. And of course, it's always best to utilize a professional reserve specialist to complete this, a reserve study, essentially. If you are in Tennessee or Georgia, we have some people from Georgia, I believe, and maybe some from Tennessee. There's no statutory requirement to do a reserve study there either, but as John mentioned, it is good business practice to do so. And wherever you are, whatever type of community association, I would encourage you to check your governing documents as well for your association, because your governing documents may actually require a reserve study. Check with your attorney and your governing documents.
Yes, thank you, John and An, for that insight. That is very, very good advice. I'll move now to our next question presented by a board member. What should our association do to prepare for a reserve study? And to this, I'm going to look to our subject matter expert again. Drew, can you help us with that?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm looking at that question in a couple of different ways. If you're just trying to think if you're going to get a study done, you can go, obviously you'll need a proposal, and you can go to most reserve study providers, including myself, have an online form at the website. You just need to fill in some basic information and some profile information about the property as far as, buildings, association type, amenities, things like that, the age, what your time frame is. If you're an association that has already contracted to do a reserve study, preparing for it is really more about one of the biggest things we're challenged with is finding out history. If the property is 30 years old, we're looking back to see, okay, when was the roof replaced, or when was the waterproofing done? So history is a big part of any reserve study, especially if you're doing a level 1 or first time reserve study. So when we ask board members, when we contract with someone, we send them a confirmation and then a checklist, and we're saying, okay, can you tell us about the major, more impactful projects? These are the things that basically will drive the numbers in your reserve study. We're also going to need some financial information, at least on the reserve side. So if they have been funding for reserves, we need to know what they've been budgeting for, and of course, what their balances are, or what their balances will be by the end of the fiscal year. Because you have to remember, with a reserve study, this is a budget planning tool. So, most budgets start on the beginning of the year, January 1st. So the studies that we're working on right now, one of the questions we have is, okay, what open projects or projects do you have planned between now and the end of the year? So sometimes the board has to, think about, okay, what do we have going on, or what are we anticipating doing between now and the end of the year before our new budget year starts, because that can affect the reserves. Obviously, it can affect the balance if these things are being paid from the reserves. And obviously, it can change the life expectancy. If you're, all of a sudden we're going to be resurfacing our pool in November. Well, that will change. The cost will come out of the reserves, and obviously the pool surface will have a new life on it. So from a preparation standpoint, we again, financial information, major project history, and then of course, whatever is currently in progress or plans for the end of the year. And of course, issues. Every board's got issues. Okay, we're concerned about our pipes, or we're concerned about our cooling tower or our roof, or whatever it is. And when we do studies, we always have a meeting, so we're having some dialogue with the contact with the client. But these are things to think about. And certainly if you've had discussion, or if you brought in a third party, a consultant, to do, say, a roof inspection, we'd like to see a copy of that report. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking for in preparation of doing a reserve study.
That's great, Drew. Thank you very much. And it really is, a reserve study clearly is about the past, the present, and the future, and all the components that involve the complete history of any association. That leads me to this question. What sort of time commitment will our boards need to plan or to set aside for the reserve study, for the full scope of what it takes to create a reserve study?
Well, in terms of when we contract for a reserve study, based on our workload, if it's a level 1, a first-time reserve study or a reinspection, we do say, get this plan 3 or 4 months prior to your budget planning time. So if you're working on budgets in September, back it up 3 or 4 months, and that's when we at least need to be contracted or contacted about it, so that we can schedule it. Because most reserve study providers get very busy this time of year because everybody's doing their budgets. I mean, there are some budgets that start mid-year or October 1, but those are generally few and far between. So, in terms of if it's a first time or a reinspection study, which is more involved, 3 or 4 months notice in advance is helpful. If it's an update study without a site inspection, typically we want to get that information and get going 30 days before you need it. So that you have time to review it, and any changes or updates can be done. Now, as far as, the time commitment from the board, if it's a professionally managed property, then a lot of the work or the information we request comes from the manager, and from the management company, and, the general questions that we ask, so the board's involvement, obviously if it's a self-managed property, that's going to be put on the board to do it. But on professionally managed property, a lot of that work is done by the management company. Now, typically we'll have a meeting, and a lot of board or committee members will want to be involved and have some input. Again, like a 1-hour meeting or less, depending on the scope of the property. And then, of course, once the report is done, the board or the committee will want to review it, probably have some questions, perhaps a follow-up meeting. So, typically with a board's involvement, a pre-inspection or a pre-site inspection meeting, and then a follow-up after the report or the draft of the report is completed.
Thank you for that, Drew. And I will say that I know in my partnership with An and with John Lee, both panelists here, that we have seen that, how critical it is to have a quality partnership and relationship with management when addressing reserves, because we're there to help guide and advise the board and lead them through this very difficult process, as part of the budget season. So let's pause the discussion for a moment. And give the audience a chance to give us some input with our first poll question. And here it is. How often does your association conduct or update its reserve study? Please choose only one of the choices. Every year, every 2 to 3 years, regularly, after every capital improvement projects. We don't conduct them with any regularity. So let's give everyone a moment to answer the poll. Okay. So it looks like, I'm not seeing, here we go. So it looks like the majority of everyone, we almost have a tie, 39% and 41%. It's either every 2 to 3 years, or we don't conduct one with regularity. And that really speaks to the pattern. You know, once you get into conducting a reserve study and you see the advantages that it brings to the association, that it's something that's part of the annual process of the budget season. Drew, is this sort of what you see in the clients that you deal with? How often do you see that reserve studies are updated?
Yeah, that's interesting, the poll results, because we have, I guess we would call it a faithful group of clients that either update it regularly or within every 3 years. And then we still have, almost inevitably, because we've been doing this so long, somebody will call us that hasn't contacted us in 10, 15, 20 years. So, you know, the poll kind of speaks to that. We get asked that question a lot. And so, you know, there's not really a right answer for everyone. But I would say, you know, best practices would be to do it every 3 years, just because of the changing costs, the financial changes, the board turnover. There's a continuity that comes from doing the reserve study at least every 3 years. Now, I will say that we do have some clients that use the reserves very heavily and very frequently, where they'll go through hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. And for them, you know, it's critical that they update it every year, and they do. You know, it's a very integral part of their day-to-day operations. Likewise, we have clients that, you know, have very light usage of the reserves. You know, every few years they might paint, have a roof replaced. You know, for them, it's good. You know, every 3 years is good. So, you know, it just depends on what type of association or how active your reserves are in terms of, you know, yearly spending. And one other thing I would mention as far as reserve and the frequency to update them. If your association goes through some sort of catastrophic event, which here in Florida is, you know, hurricanes for the most part, that typically changes a lot on your reserves. You know, the roof may get damaged and need replacement, even though it wasn't scheduled for, you know, 10 years out. And a whole assortment of things that all of a sudden had projections get completely wiped away and changed. So if your association goes through something like that, it's always wise to update the study, say the following year, once you've sort of got a plan in place of when things or what things will be replaced and when, so that the study can then accurately reflect these changes. And a lot of times it can be in the association's favor. You know, we've seen a lot of situations where, you know, they lose their roof, and all of a sudden through insurance settlements and whatnot, they have a brand new roof that was, you know, primarily paid for by insurance proceeds, you know, with a new 20 or 25-year life. So whereas, you know, in the previous study, maybe they were down to less than 5 years of life. So, you know, these are the kinds of things that, you know, you need to consider when thinking about how frequently you want to update the reserves.
Yeah, I think, Allison, if I may, I think a good line to draw, right, is to your appraisal. So I think An touched on it earlier. There is nothing in Florida statute that says you have to have a reserve study, right? But there is something that says you have to have an appraisal done every 3 years. Mm-hmm. And at least when you have an appraisal done, if you should have the discussion about updating your reserve study at that point in time. Drew, I know your firm does both appraisals and reserve studies, as do many others. So for me, that's kind of a good demarcation line. Like, it's time to update the appraisal. Let's have a discussion about the reserve study, because they're, you know, the firm may or may not be the same, but it just gives you some regularity and a timeline for updates. Drew, I want to touch on something specific on reserve studies, and it kind of pulls in from a couple of different discussions we've had so far. So in my own association where I live, we're undergoing some very large scale projects, and we have a lot of spend. And An touched on it earlier, right? What's required in the reserve study is roof, painting, and pavement, right? So those are the elements. the majority of our spend is not on those items. It's on these other really large scale items that, that are going to be attached to a special assessment. Can you tell us about any discussions that you've been involved in with your industry peers on adding elements adding required elements to reserve study that aren't necessarily just that discretionary line of if it's over 10,000, because that kind of leaves a lot of gray space, right?
Yes, you're right, John. You're right. We see special assessments, and obviously in South Florida, that's a frequent thing. I made a presentation to the Florida Bar Safety Task Force about a month ago, and after that presentation, there was a lot of open discussion. One of the things I realized is that they are very much focused on, I'll get into this a little bit maybe later on as we talk, but they were very much focused on some of these major issues that are not required, at least not spelled out in the reserves statutes. Structure, waterproofing issues, stucco delamination, major building life safety components. So I believe in CAI's Reserve Specialist Committee has also been looking into ways of making recommendations to modify that, make sure that these fairly large ticket items get addressed to some degree in the reserve study. I think that there'll probably be some legislation or maybe some language next year that includes these or makes them required. At least that's the impression I got from the questions that were asked by the task force. Mm-hmm. When we do studies, having done them for so many years in Florida, we're well aware of how corrosive the salt air environment is along coastal Florida. You can plan for all the predictable things, roofing, elevator modernization, painting, but it's those concrete spalling and waterproofing and stucco delamination numbers that just come out and bite you. So many associations, I think part of it's because they just don't know. I mean, you can, as you know, if you go and look at a property and walk around and look at it, you can identify a certain amount of spalling and deterioration, but that's only what's visible. It's very common to say, okay, that balcony has a little bit of spalling on the edge. And when they finally get around to working on it, they have to go all the way into the unit just to get to clean rebar and concrete. So the issue is also, part of it is the unknown, and a little bit of it's, I think, out of sight, out of mind. Oh, I see a little bit of spalling here. And as we know, concrete spalling costs grow exponentially if they're ignored, due to the fact that air and water gets in there with the steel rebar and causes it to expand and crack. And then you have structural integrity issues. But that, and I don't want to really go there, but that's, obviously was one of the issues over at Surfside. I don't know if that had anything to do with the cause, but it certainly was something they were addressing. And I believe in the reports, they were even talking about, what the price was 3 years ago versus what it was now, and part of that was inflation and prices going up. And part of it was the scope of the damage had gotten so much greater. So, and even if you're having HOA, there are a lot of things that often get overlooked that we see. I mean, it's completely different physical makeup of a property. But, things like stormwater systems, lake bank erosion, these are some of these sort of out of sight, out of mind things that get overlooked that can be very expensive. I mean, we even have some associations that are responsible for their sewer and water lines. Again, underground, long life expectancy, but, all of a sudden they're having to replace it. And it's a significant amount of money. So it is always a challenge, but I think both locally or statewide and nationally, they're finally kind of getting the attention they deserve. And I would be surprised if there's not some changes coming forward as far as addressing or keeping those, making so those are included, in future reserve studies.
Yeah, thank you, Drew and John, for that insight. And Drew, we have heard in our industry too that there are changes coming from Tallahassee. Yeah. So thank you for touching on that in this discussion. And that leads me to, I see another board member question here that directly relates to what John was talking about. And the question is, Can we use our reserve funds for something that is not outlined in the reserve study already? John?
Yeah, so no, you can't, unfortunately. You know, reserve dollars are meant to pay for what they're allocated for, and right, and that's why it goes through the budget process, and the budget is passed with reserves, and you see the schedule for it. But yeah, that is exactly the discussion we were just having, right? Why don't we reserve for certain elements, or we have X number of dollars? Can we use those to address something that is not in our not funded in our reserves? But yeah, unfortunately, the answer for that is no.
Is no, yeah, and that's where the word restricted really has meaning, right? The funds are restricted. They are.
You know, Allison, I'll just chime in on that. You know, what we have seen, and we've talked with the state about this. You know, clients will contact us and basically ask that question: can we take this out of the reserves? And you know, we'll look at their report, and if it's not included, the answer is no. But what I do tell them is the state does allow this, that if you have something that you want to reserve for, you can add it as long as it qualifies as being a reserve component. And then if that budget and that reserve schedule is adopted and goes into place come January 1st or whenever your budget starts, then you do have a legitimate access to use those funds for that item, but it has to be in there. So it has to be added in first. So we see that's, I don't want to call it a workaround, but we do see that happen periodically.
Yes, that is something that we experience often. So yes, thank you for that input. So we're going to give the audience a chance to answer another question. So thank you, John and Drew, for that insight. Let's put the second question up here. Does your association have fully funded reserves? Do you have fully funded reserves? Do you have reserves, but they are not fully funded? No, we do not have reserves at all, and I'm not sure. So those are your four options. Please choose one. We'll give everyone a moment to make the choice. And here we are. So here are the results. Yes, we have fully funded reserves at 41%. We have reserves, but they are not fully funded at 49%, so they're partially reserving. No, we do not have reserves at all. It's 3%. That's good to hear. And I'm not sure it's 7%. So those are really interesting results for those communities that have fully funded reserves. Is there anything that we can do over the next couple of years? I have this question from a board member to get to fully funded if they're not fully funded at the moment. John, do you have some insight?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest thing is to start fully funding, right? If you want to get fully funded. And Drew, your schedules show the dollar amount that a community has today and the dollar amount that they'll need in 5-10 years, whenever the element is due for replacement, right? So the calculations that you make in the reserve study show exactly what that contribution is, right? Even if you're paying for a large scale element in a compressed period of time, the dollars will be reflected in a reserve study. Yeah, that's the only way to do it. I mean, otherwise you end up with a shortfall when it comes time to replace, to paint, to concrete restoration, whatever the case may be. And your choice is to special assess. So the way to make it up is just to adopt fully funded reserves. And if you haven't been contributing to your reserves over a long period of time, that first number is going to have some sticker shock associated with it, right? We have a large element due for replacement in 2 years, and we haven't funded it. You're going to have 2 years to fund it then, right? And so then that's when you start looking at the math of the reserve contribution in the budget. So. And again, I want to hammer on something I said earlier. For me, the transparency is really key. So if you're not going to fully fund reserves, having that schedule at your budget meeting, showing your membership what the expectation is for when we're going to need those funds, and how much we have, just so they know, right? Just say we have large elements that we need to replace in X number of years, and we're going to need X number of dollars. Whether we get them from reserves or a special assessment, is another discussion. But every chance you can to show that, to show those numbers to your membership and just say, this is our, the building, the association, this is our asset, and this is our schedule for replacement, right?
Right. Yes. And John, and yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. And that certainly speaks to something we touched on a little earlier, was special assessments and how reserves plan based on the past, the present, and the future. And as we all know here, that if that planning isn't fully funded, then inevitably a special assessment usually comes up. So, and this is where I see, and I'm sure John and An, you can confer with this, that when hiring a reserve study company, that it's so important to have someone who's your partner. Just like your management company is your partner, you need a company. So I have a question just like this from a board member that says, when hiring a reserve study company, what should an association look for? So An, I'm going to kick that one to you, and let's give the audience some advice on how to choose a firm.
Certainly, you definitely want experience. You want a company with a lot of experience in this business. There are designations to look for when searching for a reserve specialist. Through CAI, there's what's called an RS designation. There's a professional reserve analyst designation you can look for. You want to look for qualifications, their background. Here's one thing you want to think about is, are they familiar with your geographical area? If you're from the Jacksonville area, are they familiar with that area and what the elements would, how the elements would treat your buildings and your assets? So different things like that. That's what you want to look for.
Thank you for that. And John, do you have some expertise here that you want to add?
Yeah, I actually just have a question for Drew. I mean, we've seen your work product in our communities over the years, and it's excellent, right? Your appraisals, your reserve studies. I wanted to ask Drew the same question about when you deliver a reserve study, you talked about those level ones where you're coming out and doing the initial assessment. It's a lot of information to digest. So yeah. when your firm delivers a reserve study to a community, be it a new board, a new manager, whomever it is, can you kind of just walk us through that delivery? I know the first time I looked at a reserve study, it was like Greek, right?
Yeah.
Can you walk us through that delivery and point out kind of some of the things to look out for in your reserve study? What's most important? Where you think our board should dive in a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, speaking back to the question, qualifications and geographic location, as An mentioned, are key. I mean, I've certainly seen reserve studies prepared by people that have little to no experience, and some of the numbers are quite questionable. So finding someone that has that background and that experience is your best chance of getting an accurate plan. Now, as far as, and I'm thinking back to the question you had asked me a moment ago regarding funding of reserves, and I didn't chime in, but I just want to go back for a moment. And you had mentioned this, John. If you're not fully funding, then obviously the thing you need to do is start fully funding. Obviously, you need a plan so you know where to go, but if you do have some time on your side, and we do this for clients of ours that are, underfunded, but have some time on their side, maybe 5 or 10 years before they're going to be hit with major expenses, we'll develop an alternate plan where we just ladder up their funding, whether it's an equal amount over 5 years or equal percentage over 5 years, and get them from where they are to where they need to be. These are, and this is one of these sort of philosophical conversations I've had with people recently. I hear when it comes to funding reserves, a lot of clients will say, well, look, at my age, I don't even buy green bananas, that kind of an argument. So, what I try to say to them is I say, look, you are benefiting, every day, if you're an owner in a condo, you are benefiting every day from the roof every day from the elevators, every day from the waterproofing and all of these components. So if you've lived there for 10 years, you've benefited from those as 10 over that 10-year period. And these things have aged and deteriorated over these 10-year periods. So I look at reserves and I try to impress upon people that these should be more of a pay-as-you-go expense. You know, this is the most equitable way of sharing in the cost of these expenses. You know, you have a roof that lasts 20 years and someone sells their unit after 19 and gets out without paying for anything. And the poor soul that buys in year 20 gets hit with the full expense. Whereas, you know, the person who's lived there 19 years has benefited from it. So, you know, educating the board members and by extension, the membership on why it's important to have these reserves and to build them up to an adequate level. But I always look at it and I try to explain to them, this is the pay as you go. But getting back to your other question about, you know, walking through what we do when we complete a reserve study, you know, obviously we submit a draft. And then there's typically a little bit of sticker shock. You know, there's a lot of numbers. And, you know, board members come from all kinds of backgrounds. So a lot of them are not, you know, quote unquote numbers people. So you know, it's a little bit of a foreign language. You know, most reports do have what we call an executive summary, where they highlight the key, most important numbers, you know, where you're funding, what your fund status is, what we're recommending you fund to, and then of course your projected expenditures. But typically we have to go through and walk the board through because a lot of times it's just, you know, it's foreign to them. Once we kind of take them through a few steps and say, okay, here's the schedule, here's the cash flow plan, you know, they get comfortable with it and then they can start asking, say, more in-depth questions. But if you just, you know, do a study and hand it off to them, you know, a lot of times they'll look at it and say, you know, they may look at the final number and either go with it or not, you know, but a lot of times there's just a lot of confusion. So,
yeah, Drew,
yeah.
And sorry to interrupt, but I see some questions from the audience directly related to what you're talking about now. So I want to ask you this one. What
Sure.
factors determine the cost of a reserve study, and what is the average cost of a reserve study, just to give the audience an idea?
So asking about the cost and what goes into determining the cost?
Yeah.
Well, the way we base it is obviously on what we estimate to be the time and expense to prepare the study. So if it's a first time study, you know, how many days are we going to need to be out in the field? Is there travel involved? And then of course the office time. So at least for my firm, you know, there's usually what I call a 2-to-1 ratio. So for every hour in the field, we're going to spend probably at least 2 hours in the office working on that report if it's a level 1 first time study. So we base it on you know, it's interesting because you can have a fairly large property that has a lot of repetition, you know, maybe 100 buildings that all look identical and are all built at the same time. Sometimes those can be easier to do and less time consuming than some place that has 5 buildings that are all unique, were built at different times, different constructions, or you have a variety of amenities. So when we get these proposals in, you know, we dig through what that property consists of, and you know, we sort of have a database where we assign, okay, we've got to look at 3 pools, or we've got to look at a 5-story 20-unit building, you know, that is 30 years old. We've got a boat dock to look at, or tennis court. So, you know, we take that, you know, information and we use it to estimate the cost. You know, the update fees are, you know, once this first time study is done, which is the most expensive, you know, the update fee is usually, you know, roughly 20%, give or take, of the first time fee. You know, a lot of times we will lock in, you know, and try to get people to agree to doing an update annually if that's what they need. And we'll lock in a little bit better rate just to have that continuity of doing the study every year.
Yeah,
so it does depend on the complexity and size of the property.
Definitely. And there is, you know, especially here in Florida right now, a high call for engineer reports. So yeah. I have a question here from the audience about, can a reserve study and an engineer report be combined, and what is the best practice?
Well, you know, I don't think I finished answering your first question because I just thought, you know, an average reserve study is usually less than 5,000 first time. I would say, 4 to 5,000 on, and again, I'm saying an average. Obviously, larger properties cost more, smaller properties cost less. And then update fees can be less than $1,000, depending on the size and complexity of the property. But getting back to what you were just asking, refresh my memory on that last question.
Sure,
I was thinking about 5 different things.
Right, and thank you, Drew. Yes, because we are definitely leaning on you as the expert in this field. So right now there's a lot of engineers being hired to review buildings, the condition of the buildings, especially older buildings, here in Florida with what happened in Surfside. So the question is, can they combine an engineer report and a reserve study together? And what's the best practice in that sense?
Okay, I knew it was engineering report related. So, the reserve study is a budget planning tool. So it is not going to go into the level of detail or expertise that, say, an engineering report where they're specifically hired, say, to look at the structure. Structural reports and a lot of these very sort of detailed, focused reports typically cost a lot more than reserve studies, and rightfully so, because to do a really in-depth structural inspection of a building requires some destructive testing, some invasive testing, and a lot of time as far as, if you're looking at every balcony, every exposed beam and that kind of thing. So, but what we will do is in our reports, if they have an engineering report for something, whether it's the roof or the structure, we'll incorporate those findings into the reserve study. I think it just strengthens the study, and that's also another thing that I wanted to mention, that, we get a lot of calls in our office about, they'll call and say, ask for an engineering report. And so, we'll have to kind of talk them through and find out exactly what they're looking for. But oftentimes, it is a reserve study, but sometimes they are looking for a more specific engineering report. And so a reserve study, just to be clear, what it's not is it is not an in-depth structural analysis. It's not going to tell you the structural integrity of the buildings. It's not a safety inspection report or a risk assessment. It's not going to look for code violations, or construction deficiencies. So if your concern is one of these other areas, then, that's when you would look to hire an expert in that field.
Right. And so the reserve study really is a complement to the engineer report, and then both used in determining how you're going to move forward with your budget, over the course of the coming year and the future and altogether. So I have another question from the audience. And what are your recommendations on accounting for inflation in reserve studies, given the long-term outlook of reserves?
Okay. In our reports currently, we're using a 3% inflation factor. And so what we do and what we base that on is there are publications and a lot of data out there that looks at both nationally and statewide as far as what construction prices do overall. And if you go back and look at, say, the last 20 or 30 years, many of these sort of show an inflation factor a little above 3% overall. Obviously, it's not a steady number. 2007 through 2010, there was deflation. Right now, we're seeing some significant inflationary increases across the board, and certain things are spiking. Certainly, like things like wood earlier this year, the cost just went up, tenfold, it seemed like. So, but we use a 3% inflation in our reports to, again, if you're looking at long term, it's not going to be an even number, but it will be something that will get you closer, I believe, to future costs or closer to the reality of that future cost. But you just have to keep updating it and checking on it. And we also include, in the reports, if we're projecting out into the future, one of the things we also do is build in an inflation increase into the funding side of it too. So if we're saying your costs are going up 3%, we often recommend that you increase your funding by an equal amount. So to offset that inflation so that future owners are paying more of their fair share and the current owners, say year one of a 30-year plan are not overpaying. So, inflation is a key part of these cash flow and long range plans that we do.
They are, and definitely part of the discussion at budget season, because quite often the increases that community sees at budget season is just inflation in and of itself.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I have one final question here from the audience. Do all repairs need to be funded through the reserve account, or can small repairs be funded out of the operating account? And I'm going to kick that one to On, because On, I think that's something that you and I deal with on a regular basis, almost every day, in advising our boards on regular repair and maintenance, and then the reserve, even if it's the same item.
Sure. Yeah. So when you think of regular repairs and maintenance that happen throughout the year, that should be covered by your operating funds. And we're talking about small repairs that are under $10,000, that magic number that we talked about. Anything above $10,000, resurfacing your pool, painting, replacing your chiller in your building. I mean, those are major expenses, and that's what should be covered from the reserve funds.
Yeah.
Yes. You agree, Drew? Yep.
Yeah. And also, repairs are, if it's just a maintenance repair, it should be most likely operating. If it is something in the term that we've started using more frequently is called corrective maintenance, which if you think about stucco delamination or things like that, are key. So if you start using the reserves to sort of supplement your operating and paying for all these repairs, it's going to hurt the reserves. And then you're going to kind of get in a cycle where now you're going to have to bump up the reserves because you've basically been tapping into it for repairs that are not what would qualify as a reserve item. So you kind of have to be careful about that. I tell clients when they ask me if we can charge something to the reserves, obviously if it's in there or not is the first thing. If it is in there, I ask them, is it a repair? And we look at it, will it extend or increase the remaining life? Or is it a repair that is just going to basically get you to the life that is already in the plan? So if it's like an overhaul of a major piece of equipment, all of a sudden you've added several years to your life. If it was, say, for example, a generator, and it gets overhauled, or a fire pump, this would be something that you could charge to the reserves because you're adding more life to the component, as opposed to just say sort of a garden variety roof repair, some flashing leak or something, where you're not really buying any more time. You're just trying to get the life out of it that you were already expecting. So those are some of the qualifiers we use when we talk about whether repairs can be used for the reserves.
That's a really good distinction, because that is a question that comes up quite often, especially when, big price tags come for repair and maintenance items. Yeah. And they're on the list. Yeah. So I wanted to take a moment and thank you, Drew, John, On, for all your expertise that you offered us today. I think we touched on a lot of points, probably a lot more discussion to come in the future. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today on Ask the Experts virtual event, The Path to Great Reserve Studies. Like I said before, we're putting contact information for all the panelists in the chat, so feel free to reach out to all these experts if you have more questions. And we hope you found this information very helpful. And take what you've learned today and put it into practice. Budget season is right now, and call on your managers to really help guide you through the process, and our panelist experts here. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.